This is everything you need to know about chess. Chess is played on an 8x8 grid of light and dark squares. Some people say white and black, but they're rarely ever actually white and black. They're usually just shades of brown. So on the 8x8 grid, that is a chessboard of light and dark squares. The white square should be on your right. This is a rook. It can move in a straight line in any direction as long as it's a straight line, and they go on the corners. The knight, also known as a horse, can move to 8 different spaces. The space that it will go to is always going to be the opposite color that it is on. It is one diagonal and one straight, if you want to think of it that way. It also can be, I'm only touching the squares where it can go to, so 2 straight, 1 over. It could be 1 over and then 2 to the side. Any way you want to think of it, this is the only piece that jumps over any other piece to get to the spaces it can move to. And that goes right next to your rook or your castle. Beep, beep, beep. The bishop moves diagonally and has to stay on the color that it starts on, and it never can get off of its own color. And the bishops go right next to the knight. Beep. On the second row, put your pawns. You have 8 pawns. The trick to remember where the queens belong is the queen matches to the color. So if you are the light queen, it should go on the light colored square. And the dark, same with the dark queen. The dark queen goes on the dark colored square. And the king, the most important piece of all, goes right there. And the only place remaining.
The main point of chess is to get the king.
The queen can move like the rook or the bishop. The queen can move straight and diagonally. The king can only move 1 space at a time, but he can go any direction, but only 1 space. Pawns, they can move 1 space at a time. On the pawns, first turn, they can move 2 spaces. In order to attack another piece, though, the pawn only attacks diagonally. It only can go diagonally if there is another piece there. Another special thing about the pawn is if there is a pawn all the way up here and the pawn, another pawn were to move 2 spaces through the attack that this pawn potentially has, the turn after, and only the turn after, this pawn can respond with attacking a space that is not occupied and taking this pawn. That is called an en passant.
When I get a pawn to the opposite end of the board, now I can get back any piece that you've taken. Or if we were playing on computer, or if I had an extra set of pieces, you could select back any piece you want. But you almost always want to select back a queen, because the queen is the most powerful piece, usually. You can't get back another king. That's not allowed. And you can't get another pawn, because that wouldn't make any sense.
A king may castle if later in the game there is nothing in between the king and the rook. The king can move 2 spaces towards the rook, and the rook would go to the other side. Or another way to think of it is the rook comes to the king goes through the castle out to the other side as an escape. It's the only time you ever move 2 pieces in 1 turn. It's also possible to castle on the other side. If you were to move out pieces during the game and want to perform a castle with your rook and the king would go 2 spaces towards the rook goes to the other side. Or if you want to think of it this way, the rook comes to the king and the king goes through the castle, comes out the other side. And that is the special move that can only be done if there is nothing in between, there is no check in between, you are not in check, and the rook and the king has not moved.
When you put a player in check, you have to declare that I'm putting you in check. Check means somewhere where he's in danger. You're not allowed to move into check. When you put someone in check, then the king has to move out of check. So what I can do to get out of check is I could put something in the way. If the end of the game comes down to one player having one king, and the other player not being able to put them in checkmate for 12 moves, it is a stalemate. If you are unable to move on your turn, that is a stalemate.
The fastest game of chess possible is when the king's bishop's pawn moves forward. Black would move its king's pawn forward. Then white would move its king's knight's pawn forward 2 spaces. Now, on black's or dark's second turn, the queen is able to move out diagonally to this square, putting white in checkmate. It is checkmate because the king has absolutely nowhere to move because it is all occupied by its own pieces. None of the pieces that white has can move in front of the king to protect it or to attack this queen. There is technically about 8 ways to get here because of the combinations of how far these 2 pawns can move and the order in which you move them. There is over 100,000 different first 2 moves in chess, so this is a really rare chess game, but it does happen. That explains the fastest chess game. Hope you enjoyed that. If you did, I have plenty other chess video ideas. Like, for example, the king is kind of the least powerful piece of the game, but he's also the most powerful piece because it's all about him. So I know a completely different kind of chess that makes the king more powerful. And if you want to see that, give this video a thumbs up and leave it in the comments, subscribe.